1787. 11 years have passed since the United States of America declared their independence from the British Empire. But for the Americans, building a new nation is proving a formidable challenge. The infant republic is mired in debt, as well as political and economic turmoil. Veterans of the War of Independence, unpaid and desperate, mount an insurrection, Shays' Rebellion. The new federal government survives this crisis, but it is hamstrung by the Articles of Confederation, the country's first constitution, which severely limits its power. So, later that year, lawmakers gather in Philadelphia to draft a new U.S. Constitution with much stronger powers for the executive. Meanwhile, in America's newly proclaimed Northwest Territory, another crisis is brewing. In theory, this vast region has been ceded to the United States by the British following the Revolutionary War. It stretches from the Appalachian Mountains in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, and from the Great Lakes in the north to the Ohio River in the south. It was 300,000 square miles of untamed land, abundant in natural resources, and as far as the U.S. is concerned, ripe for expansion. The federal government plans to sell the land to settlers to pay off its enormous debts from the Revolutionary War, about $40 million in all. There is no shortage of demand. Thousands of settlers are eager to travel west, to build new farms and towns, and start new lives on the frontier. But there is a problem. Not only have thousands of settlers already crossed illegally into the Northwest Territory, the Native American tribes who already live there will bitterly resist any invasion of their ancestral homeland. The United States is stumbling into a war of conquest, a war for which it's badly unprepared, against an enemy it woefully underestimates. European settlers had been encroaching into Native American land for nearly 200 years. The violence was endemic. Some eastern tribes had been virtually annihilated. And the War of Independence, in which most Native Americans backed the British, saw intense fighting across the frontier. Warriors from tribes such as the Miami, Shawnee, and Lenape, also known as the Delaware, targeted U.S. settlements along the Ohio River, hoping to drive away the intruders. Local militia companies, part-time settler soldiers, responded with reprisal raids. One notorious incident occurred in 1782 at Gnadenhutten. Here, Pennsylvania militiamen massacred 96 unresisting Lenape Christian converts, men, women, and children. Native American raids could be equally brutal. There were hundreds of victims on both sides, a cycle of violence that continued year after year. But now, the U.S. government is determined to impose orderly and safe settlement of the region, and crucially, to begin selling the land to settlers, corporations, and speculators. Since independence, the U.S. government has imposed a series of one-sided treaties on the Native Americans, claiming their land by right of conquest, and using bribes, threats, and violence to get its way. Congress now goes a step further, formally establishing the Northwest Territory with clear rules for its surveying and settlement. Under the leadership of Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant, the tribes have organized themselves into the Northwestern Confederacy. They reject and denounce the U.S. treaties and the new plans for settlement. These tribes are determined to hold the line of U.S. settlement at the Ohio River and will fight to do so. With violence flaring across the Northwest Territory, it will fall to America's first president, George Washington, to find a solution to the crisis. George Washington, inaugurated as the first president of the United States in April 1789, faces many daunting challenges in his first term. High among them, the national debt and the factions forming within his own cabinet. Now, the escalating crisis in the Northwest Territory joins the list. Washington declares his wish to deal with Native Americans honorably and fairly. Yet, at the same time, he will allow nothing to stand in the way of the Republic's security or expansion. He's also being lobbied by a powerful association of land speculators, including his own Secretary of War, Henry Knox, who are demanding action. Their concern is that the violence in the Northwest Territory will harm their investments. In 1789, a final attempt is made to persuade the tribes to sign away their land, but negotiations at Fort Harmar are boycotted by the most powerful tribes. And so, in the summer of 1790, Washington authorizes military action. He orders the U.S. Army to launch a punitive expedition, a show of power to deter further attacks by Native Americans on U.S. settlers. It is an order for an invasion. Command of the expedition falls to Brevet Brigadier General Josiah Harmar, the nation's most senior Army officer. He is a distinguished Revolutionary War veteran who'd served with Washington at Valley Forge. But Harmar is also rumored to be a hard drinker and insists his troops follow the European model of war, relying on drill and close order formations which are completely unsuited to frontier warfare. The forces at his disposal are extremely limited. The victorious Continental Army, which had defeated the British, has long been disbanded. In its place, Congress has authorized the formation of a single infantry regiment, around 700 men. So the bulk of Harmar's expedition will be made up of militiamen from Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Few of these were experienced frontiersmen. Rather, they're often those who lacked the wits or wealth to avoid militia service. Many are old or very young, with little training and no experience of the woods. A stark contrast to the enemy they'd soon come up against. General Harmar plans to march his force north from Fort Washington, along 150 miles of mostly forest trails, to destroy the Miami settlement at Key Kayonke. He'll be supported by another mixed force of regulars and militia, 330 men commanded by Major Hamtramck, marching from Vincennes. On October 7, 1790, Harmar sets out on the United States' first major military operation since independence. After an 8-day march, his force reaches the Miami village at Kikayange, only to find it torched and abandoned. The Miami have destroyed their own homes and apparently vanished. But Harmar's troops are being watched. Hundreds of warriors of the Northwest Confederacy have assembled to resist the U.S. attack. They are led by Miami War Chief Mishkinaqua, aka Little Turtle, Shawnee Chief Wayapir Senwa, aka Blue Jacket, and Bakangahelas of the Lenape. They and their warriors are determined, well-armed, and know every inch of their homeland. Meanwhile, 150 miles southwest, Hamtramck's militia have mutinied, refusing to advance further into the forests, and he has to turn back. General Harmar is on his own. His force spends 4 days burning villages in the area and destroying any food stores they can discover. Then, on October 19th, one of his companies is lured into an ambush. Attacked by more than 100 warriors, 150 militiamen turn and run. A single platoon of regulars stand their ground and are massacred. Around 30 U.S. soldiers are killed, with another 40 militia missing. 2 days later, Harmar decides his mission is complete and sets off for Fort Washington. Hours later, his scouts report that villagers are returning to Kikayange. Hoping to finally engage and defeat the enemy, Harmar's troops make a dawn attack. They expect to have the element of surprise. But once more, they stumble into an ambush. In confused fighting, more than 100 U.S. soldiers are killed, scalped, and left where they've fallen. Today, many mistakenly believe scalping to have been an exclusively Native American practice. In fact, for more than a century, it had been widely taken up by European settlers, often with encouragement from colonial authorities who paid bounties for native scalps as proof of death. What had begun as a ritual practice among certain tribes had become far more widespread and was now routinely carried out by both sides in the frontier wars. Harmar returns with his shaken force to Fort Washington, where he claims success. He has, after all, destroyed 5 Miami villages and considerable grain stores. It is a heavy blow to the tribes and will mean great hardship that winter. But others saw it differently. The expedition has gone down in history as Harmar's defeat, and at the time it was the largest U.S. defeat by Native Americans. Harmar is later exonerated by a court-martial, but his reputation never recovers. That winter, both sides continue their raids across the Northwest Territory. In January 1791, at Big Bottom, Lenape and Wyandot warriors killed 12 settlers, including 2 children. Such attacks spread alarm across the territory and threatened the entire U.S. project of settlement, upon which powerful interests now depend. Settlers fear to travel west. Land speculators are up in arms. President Washington now turns to the governor of the Northwest Territory, 54-year-old Scottish-born Arthur Sinclair. Sinclair had plenty of military experience. Like Washington, he'd served as a British officer in the French and Indian War, and in '59 he'd stormed the heights of Quebec with General Wolfe. During the Revolutionary War, he joined the Continental Army and was with Washington when he crossed the Delaware. But his record was tarnished in 1777 by his decision to abandon Fort Ticonderoga to the British without a fight. Sinclair now suffers from severe gout, but this does not dissuade President Washington from giving him the rank of Major General and orders to launch a second expedition against the Northwestern Confederacy. This time, the tribes must be taught a severe and unequivocal lesson: comply with U.S. demands or face annihilation. Congress authorizes the raising of a second regular infantry regiment for the expedition. However, the prospect of frontier service is so unenticing that it proves impossible to recruit enough men to fill its ranks. Sinclair's force will number not the 3,000 or 4,000 men originally envisaged, but around 2,000. These include 500 regular infantry from the 1st and 2nd Regiment, 100 mounted dragoons, and 10 3-pounder and 6-pounder cannon. The 1st and 2nd Levy regiments provide 800 short-service volunteers, though almost all of these are raw recruits. Of the militia, Captain Faulkner's Pennsylvanian riflemen are experienced frontier fighters, but there's only 60 of them, while most of the 400 Kentucky militia are completely inexperienced. The Northwestern Confederacy knows that their victory over General Harmar will not go unanswered, and they too prepare for another U.S. attack. For the tribes, it is a daunting prospect. A battle for survival, in which they know their families, villages, and livelihoods will be targeted indiscriminately. But the common threat brings together warriors from a dozen tribes, about 1,400 in all, making it one of the largest Native American armies ever assembled on the frontier. Miami War Chief Little Turtle will again play a leading role, alongside Blue Jacket and Bakongahelas. War chiefs organize the warriors according to tribe and language, and they are well armed. Many carry Brown Bess muskets, supplied by the British at Fort Detroit. For close combat, they carry clubs, tomahawks, and knives. Many warriors will paint their face before battle, a ritual preparation for combat that also serves to terrify the enemy. Summer 1791. Sinclair's orders are to leave Fort Washington no later than July 10th and return to the Miami villages at Key Kayonga. President Washington particularly warns him to be alert for ambushes on the march. Once Sinclair has eliminated all resistance at Kikayange, he is to build a fort and garrison it with 1,200 men. This stronghold will allow the U.S. to assert its control of the area and counter British influence from Fort Detroit. The British are supposed to have evacuated this outpost following the Revolutionary War, but they have not done so, and now use it as a base to encourage and support Native American resistance to the U.S. Sinclair's expedition, however, is in trouble before it can even set off. The U.S. Army's supply system relies on private contractors, most of whom are brazenly corrupt. They have pocketed most of the funds intended for the expedition, meaning Sinclair is seriously short of food, ammunition, and equipment. Precious weeks are lost as he urgently seeks to secure proper supplies for his troops, while rush training the many raw recruits in his force. Meanwhile, 2 preparatory attacks are launched against the Native Americans. In May, Brigadier General Charles Scott leads a mounted militia raid that burns several villages and takes 41 hostages to be used in future negotiations. 2 months later, Lieutenant Wilkinson leads a second raid that burns more villages and crops. They take 34 hostages, including the daughter of Miami War Chief Little Turtle. The raids are supposed to distract the tribes, to keep them off balance ahead of the main attack. All they really achieve is to enrage and unite the Northwestern Confederacy like never before. And when Sinclair's army is finally ready to march north that autumn, they will be ready and waiting. That summer, Sinclair's force assembles near Fort Washington, today the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Troops then advance 18 miles to the banks of the Great Miami River and construct a supply base named Fort Hamilton. General Sinclair, however, has to travel 70 miles to Lexington to find his militia reinforcements. In the end, he gets just 400 men, less than half what he'd been promised. In his absence, his second-in-command, Major General Richard Butler, is in charge. 48 years old, Irish-born, Butler had been a distinguished regimental commander in the Revolutionary War, frequently praised by Washington himself. He also has considerable experience of negotiating with the Northwestern Confederacy and knows several of the chiefs personally. Following Sinclair's orders, as soon as Fort Hamilton is complete, Butler leads the army north. It's October 4th, a late start for what had been planned as a summer campaign. The nights are already colder and days shorter. The army's advance through the forest is painfully slow. Narrow trails have to be widened for wagons and artillery. But there is a dire shortage of axes and saws. For the first 5 days of the advance, the army averages just 4.5 miles a day. When Sinclair rejoins the army, he is infuriated by the snail-like progress. But at every stage, he is hampered by a lack of equipment and supplies. He is particularly concerned about the shortage of flour for baking bread. On October 12th, heavy rain is followed by the first frost. And in freezing mud, Sinclair's army grinds to a halt. Conditions for the troops are miserable. It rains constantly. Rations have been halved, and morale is at rock bottom. soldiers begin to desert in growing numbers. Incredibly, the 6-month contracts of many levy troops now start to expire mid-campaign. And as soon as their time is up, many, understandably, choose to go home. 9 days into the advance, 40 miles north of Fort Hamilton, Sinclair orders the construction of another supply base. This one will be named Fort Jefferson. It takes 2 weeks to build. Sinclair's decision to secure his supply route in this fashion is militarily prudent, but it's costing a lot of time. And his troops remain cold, wet, and hungry. At Fort Jefferson, 3 soldiers are caught trying to desert. Sinclair decides to make an example of them, and they are hanged. The army is now down to 1,500 men. Already a third of its strength has been lost to sickness, desertion, or left behind to garrison forts. Things are so bad, Sinclair considers turning back. He himself is suffering agonizing attacks of gout that leave him unable to ride a horse. But he decides to continue the advance. A few days later, it begins to snow, and the army, having again run out of flour, halts once more. As U.S. troops await supplies, Little Turtle and fellow commanders of the Northwestern Confederacy have been formulating their response to the expedition. They have observed the slow progress of Sinclair's force and already picked off a few stragglers and deserters. They know their forces are now evenly matched in numbers. So rather than retreat, as they'd done the previous year, the chiefs decide to challenge the U.S. Army head-on, in battle. The dense woodland and their experience as hunters and warriors will give them an advantage. Yet, it is a break with their usual hit-and-run tactics, and extremely high risk. But so too are the stakes. General Sinclair is oblivious to the looming threat. His handful of scouts from the allied Chickasaw tribe have failed to detect the large enemy force. Now, he makes a fateful decision. Expecting a vital flour convoy to arrive any day, he fears it will be hijacked by deserters from his own army. So he dispatches Major Hamtramck and 300 men of the 1st Regiment, his best troops, to find the convoy and escort it safely to the army. Then, he resumes his march. On November 3rd, believing himself to be within striking distance of his target, Kikiongi, although in reality completely lost, he gives the order to set up camp. He chooses a position atop a steep-sided plateau beside the Wabash River. Trusting to the strong natural defenses, he gives no order to fortify the camp, and while most of the army bivouacs in rectangular formation on the high ground, limited space means the militia companies have to camp 300 yards away, on the other side of the Wabash, here just a shallow stream. If there is an attack, it will be very difficult for either camp to support the other. At that moment, more than 1,000 warriors of the Northwestern Confederacy are assembling, just 2.5 miles away. They know exactly where the U.S. forces are, and the next morning, at dawn, they will attack. In the cold early morning darkness of November 4th, 1,200 warriors move into position. They are in a crescent formation. On the left, Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi warriors. On the right, Wyandot, Mingo, and Cherokee. And in the center, Shawnee, Lenape, and Miami. Just before 7 a.m., with the sun's first light streaking through the trees, they let out a giant war cry and advance. In the U.S. camp, soldiers are making breakfast. Rumors swirl of recent sightings of Native Americans, reports which have not been passed to General Sinclair. Now, militia sentries to the west are horrified to see hundreds of warriors advancing through the trees. They fire their weapons and run, pursued by a hail of musket balls. The inexperienced militia are taken completely by surprise. They fire a few shots and either run or are cut down where they stand. Their camp is overrun in minutes, survivors scrambling through the freezing water of the Wabash and up the slope to the main camp. Here, U.S. regulars and levy regiments are stood too, alerted by the sound of war cries and musket fire. Their 6 cannon are loaded and ready to fire. But panic-stricken militia rushing into camp block their line of fire, and it is difficult to target an enemy who moves in small groups, dashing from cover to cover. When the guns do open fire, their shots go high, crashing through branches overhead. While Miami, Shawnee, and Lenape warriors make a frontal attack on the camp, focusing attention, the 2 wings of the Native American Army push through the woods to encircle Sinclair's camp. U.S. outposts are quickly overrun or flee back to camp. Firing from cover, Native American sharpshooters begin to pick off U.S. gun crews and officers. Within 30 minutes, a quarter of Sinclair's force are casualties or have fled into the woods. More men are falling every minute. Sinclair recognizes the danger his army is in and orders Lieutenant Colonel Dark, commanding the 1st Levy Regiment, to clear the rear of the camp. Dark takes 5 companies, about 300 men, and leads them forward in a wheeling bayonet charge to the right. He is supported by 50 mounted dragoons on the left. Wyandot warriors fall back before them. But it is a trap. They are luring the U.S. troops out of position. By the time they reach Buck Run Creek, they are cut off and surrounded. The Wyandots renew their attack, inflicting heavy losses on Dark's men as they fall back to camp. Meanwhile, Shawnee warriors attack the southern end of the camp, where the slope is less steep. They overwhelm dragoons and levy troops guarding the perimeter and break into the center of the camp. Here they fall on wounded soldiers and civilians sheltering behind the front line. These include camp followers, servants, cooks, wives, a few children. Dozens are killed. Sinclair sends Major Hart, commanding the 2nd Regiment, to clear the camp at Bayonet Point and rescue any survivors. Hart's attack is successful, but he is shot and killed, and his men suffer heavy losses. About half the U.S. regular officers are now dead, and Second-in-Command Major General Butler has been wounded twice. Some soldiers, stunned by the horrors unfolding around them, simply give up and cower behind any cover they can find. It is now 8:30 a.m. A short lull in the fighting follows, which Sinclair uses to pull in his perimeter and form a tighter defense. It is the quiet before the storm. Little Turtle and the war chiefs are rallying their men for one final attack. Two hours have passed since the initial attack, and Sinclair sees that if they do not break out through the enemy lines now, his entire force will be wiped out. The handful of surviving officers rally the men for a do-or-die charge, back down the trail by which they'd arrived. With fixed bayonets, U.S. regulars lead the way, pushing through the enemy's skirmish line. Anyone who can still walk hurries behind, but dozens of wounded are left to their fate. The breakout soon turns into a mad dash as terrified survivors dump weapons and kit in their race to escape. Sinclair lingers at the rear of the column to ensure as many get clear as possible. He is one of the last to leave the battlefield. Warriors pursue the shattered U.S. Army for several miles. Then they return to the campsite to loot and finish off the wounded. Among them, Major General Butler. The warriors of the Northwestern Confederacy celebrate into the night. The Battle of the Wabash, which would come to be known as Sinclair's defeat, is over. The U.S. rout doesn't stop until exhausted survivors reach Fort Jefferson that evening, a distance of 30 miles. Here, the roll is taken, and their appalling losses revealed. 2/3 of the army have been either killed, wounded, or are missing. All 6 guns have been lost, along with the baggage train and 1,200 muskets. Native American losses are around 20 dead and 40 wounded. It has been an utter rout and a humiliating defeat, the largest the United States Army will ever suffer against Native Americans, and costlier than any battle of the Revolutionary War. But it was not entirely unforeseen. General Harmar, defeated himself by Little Turtle the previous year, had expressed grave concerns about Sinclair's expedition. His views were recorded by Lieutenant Denny, unfortunate enough to have served in both expeditions. Harmar saw with what material the bulk of the army was composed. Men collected from the streets and prisons of the cities, hurried out into the enemy's country, and the officers commanding them totally unacquainted with the business in which they were engaged. Not any one department was sufficiently prepared, both quartermaster and contractors extremely deficient. It was a matter of astonishment to him that the commanding general, who was acknowledged to be perfectly competent, should think of hazarding, with such people and under such circumstances, his reputation and life, and the lives of so many others. Knowing, too, the enemy with whom he was going to contend, an enemy perhaps superior to an equal number of the best men that could be taken against them. Sinclair's defeat led to the United States' first congressional investigation. Their report cleared Sinclair of personal blame, but found a long list of failures in the preparation and execution of his campaign. The next U.S. general sent to take on the Northwestern Confederacy, General Mad Anthony Wayne, would first impose major reforms on the U.S. Army. He would insist on more resources, greater professionalism, improved training and tactics, and better reconnaissance. For the Native Americans, the Battle of the Wabash was a brilliant victory, won through courage and tactical skill. It marks out Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Monongahela as among the most successful Native leaders of all time in the wars against the United States. But it also proves to be the high point of their resistance. Their enemy would soon escalate the Northwest Indian War, and under the leadership of General Wayne, bring it to a conclusion at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The inexorable westward march of the United States would continue. Thank you to Osprey Publishing for kind permission to use several of their images in this video. You can find links to some great books by Osprey about America's frontier wars in the video description. Thank you also to artists John Buxton, Todd Price, and Bryant White for permission to use their work in this video. To view more of their fantastic works, follow the links in the description. Thanks to the Patreon supporters who help to make this channel possible. From builders such as Oscar Lopez, John Hale, and Flonzy, to citizens such as S. Tanto, Nathan Dern, and H. Spartazan, and heroes like Alessandro Cattorcini. Join their ranks by joining us on Patreon, where you'll get early, ad-free access to new videos,